Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we'll continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. Miss Reed has been coping with winter. It snowed off and on for over 3 weeks, and a very trying time was had by all. Mrs. Pringle seemed to take the snow as a personal insult directed toward her by a malevolent weather god, and loud were her daily lamentations about the state of the school floors and the wicked way the children brought the snow inside on their boots. It was useless to try to placate her, and useless, too, to bully the children into greater care. The snow was everywhere, and after a time I decided that the only thing to do was to be philosophical about it. "It can't last forever," I said, trying to comfort my surly cleaner. "Look at the catkins that are showing on the hedge." "Sure sign the spring cleaning will want doing," replied Mrs. Pringle, enjoying her misery. Irritated though I was by her dogged determination to see the gloomy side of things, I was not blind to the fact that she was not looking at all well. One day I ventured to comment on it. Was she still dieting? She gave a grunt. "I lost 2 pounds last month, and even that never pleased Dr. Martin. He's a hard taskmaster, that one. I wouldn't care to be under the knife when he's holding the handle. Got no feelings, I told him straight. I get the stomachache some awful nights, but he only laughs when I tells him." "Perhaps you're doing too much," I said in an unguarded moment. Mrs. Pringle rose to the bait beautifully. "Of course I'm doing too much. It's my nature. You're a giver, not a taker, my girl, my old mother used to say, and I fair gets wore out. What with this here school to keep clean, well, try to keep clean would be truer, and our Minnie driving me mad, and the worry over this place closing next year." "Closing next year?" I echoed in astonishment. "Who told you that?" Mrs. Pringle looked surprised in her turn. "Why, it's general knowledge in the village. And at Beech Green and at Caxley come to that. Why else are they having new buildings at Mr. Annet's? And what about that managers' meeting? I tell you, Miss Reed, you must be the last person to know. It's the talk of the parish, and a fine old rumpus there's going to be before long." I gazed at her, speechless with dismay. All my old worries, suspended for some weeks and ignored because of more pressing claims on my time, now flocked back to haunt me like so many evil birds. "So it's no wonder I'm not myself," continued Mrs. Pringle with some satisfaction. "I can feel myself growing old afore my time. It's as much as I can do to get round my own housework these days, let alone this lot. You'll see my place looking like Mrs. Coggs before long, I shouldn't wonder." "Never," I said, finding my voice. "Which reminds me," said my cleaner, picking a piece of squashed clay from the front desk, "that silly woman's been in court and got go again in 3 weeks." "Why?" "Them magistrates wants reports on her before passing sentence. At least that's what the Caxley Chronicle said." She snorted with disgust. "Reports! I can tell you, I could have given 'em a report on Mrs. Coggs on the spot. Wouldn't have needed 3 weeks if I'd been consulted." She straightened up and went limping pathetically to the lobby. "Bring any more of that dratted snow in here," I heard her shout threateningly, "and I'll lar up the lot of you." "Can't help it," Patrick shouted back impudently. "Anyway, it started again, so there'll be lots more, for days and days and days." He sounded exceedingly happy about it. Mrs. Pringle's rumblings could be heard in answer, but I could not catch the exact words. Above the turmoil, Patrick's clear treble rang out triumphantly. "And anyway, I likes it." Chapter 17. Renewed Fears. The court at Caxley meets twice a week, and Mrs. Coggs duly appeared 3 weeks after her first attendance. The vicar had promised to escort her and to make himself available to speak on her behalf, should the magistrates so allow. But on the very day of the hearing, Mr. Partridge was stricken with gastric influenza and was obliged to keep to his bed. Mrs. Partridge, having left various drinks and some very unpleasant medicine on the bedside table, left the patient and collected Mrs. Coggs herself. The vicar, ill as he was, nevertheless struggled into an upright position for long enough to write a letter to the court expressing his view on Mrs. Coggs's hitherto blameless character and his apologies for absence. Armed with this, Mrs. Partridge entered the annex to the court and prepared to wait indefinitely with her luckless companion. When the case was called, Mrs. Coggs faced the bench with apathetic bewilderment, and Mrs. Partridge sat at the back feeling overawed by the general solemnity. Reports were handed up to the magistrates by the probation officer, and silence reigned as they perused them. Every now and again, old Miss Dewberry gave a snort of disgust. Her fellow magistrates were quite used to this. It did not express shock at the facts presented by the probation officer, but simply impatience for such dreadful phrases as peer group, siblings, and meaningful relationship with which such reports are invariably sprinkled, and which drove Miss Dewberry, a lover of plain English, near to despair. Mrs. Partridge gave the vicar's letter to the usher, who duly gave it to the clerk, who gave it to the magistrates to add to their papers. At length, Colonel Austen rose, saying gruffly, "The bench will retire to consider this case." And the three magistrates, papers in hand, made their way to the fastness of the retiring room. The clerk to the justices, the usher, the solicitors, and general public were just wondering if there would be time for a quick cup of hot liquid from a machine in the lobby labeled tea or coffee, but bearing no resemblance to either, or better still, a hasty smoke, when the magistrates returned and hope was deferred. "We propose," said Colonel Austen to the trembling Mrs. Coggs, "to make a probation order for a period of 2 years. Just listen carefully." He turned over a dozen or so pages of a booklet before him. His fellow magistrates were used to this delay and their chairman's growing impatience as he stumbled through taking the oath on the Koran, conditional discharge, and other irrelevant matters, and were relieved when their ever-ready clerk leapt to his feet and found the place for him, with the sort of fatherly smile fond papas give their offspring when they have tracked down the collect for the day at matins. Colonel Austen read out the order in a military fashion, and on being asked if she would comply with the requirements, Mrs. Coggs said, "Yes, please, sir. Thank you, sir." "You may stand down," said Colonel Austen, and Mrs. Coggs, still quaking, was led by the usher to Mrs. Partridge, who accompanied her from the court, closely pursued by the probation officer. "She got off lightly," said Mrs. Pringle later to me. "Wouldn't have got probation in my mother's day. I wonder they didn't let her off altogether." "It means that someone will have access to the household," I said mildly, "and surely that's a good idea. Arthur will be out before her probation order ends, and I think it is a very good thing that she'll be having some guidance then." "But what about them things she took, never paid for 'em?" "They were returned at the time," I said. "Well, I wouldn't want to eat anything Mrs. Coggs had been handling," said Mrs. Pringle, determined to have the last word, and making sure by leaving me rapidly. The rumors of closure still rumbled about the village, but I did my best to ignore them despite inner qualms. George Annett, however, brought all my fears to the fore again by calling in on choir practice night to acquaint me with a new problem. "I heard today," he said, "that Mrs. Allen is leaving at the end of this term. She's only got a couple of years to do, but her husband has had a stroke, and she's decided to give up now. What about it?" I felt a little nettled. I'd like plenty of time to consider things. Too much, Amy tells me. Some things are better decided at once. "What about what?" I said to gain time. "Putting in for the post, of course," said George impatiently. "It's one of the largest junior schools in Caxley and very well thought of. Suit you well." "I don't really think I want it," I said slowly. "And anyway, after such a small school as this one, I doubt if I stand a chance. "Rubbish!" exclaimed George. "You're damn well qualified, and you know the county want to appoint from their own people at the moment, before advertising. You stand as good a chance or better than the rest. You think about it, my girl." He vanished churchwards and left me in turmoil. How I hate having to make a decision. I have the reputation, I heard once with amazement, of making up my mind very swiftly. The answer is that I find suspense so exhausting that I decide quickly in order to cut short the agony. Now here I was again, faced with shall I or shan't I, and very unpleasant I found it. Mrs. Allen's school was on one of the new estates on the edge of Caxley, and had earned a shining reputation for solid schooling with fun thrown in. It would be a post which would attract a great many applicants, and I spoke truly when I told Mr. Annett that my chances would be slight. On the whole, I felt that I should be wasting my time to apply. Then, too, there was the problem of a house. No doubt I should be allowed to stay on at Fairacre for a time, but if the school closed, then presumably the schoolhouse would be sold when the rest of the property came on the market. I certainly had no money to buy a house in Caxley, and anyway, would I want one? Oh dear, why did George have to unsettle me like this? I pottered about distractedly in the kitchen, wet dishcloth in hand, wiping the top of the cooker. The stains seemed worse than usual, and I squeezed a large dollop of liquid cleaner onto the top and rubbed bemusedly. If only I could hear something definite from the office. It would be disastrous if I applied for that post and got it, some hope I thought, and then found that Fairacre School was to stay as it was. What a problem! The stains seemed to be a problem too, and on investigation I found that I had squeezed a dollop of hand lotion instead of cleaner onto the surface. The stove was not improved. I chucked the dishcloth into the sink and went to get a glass of sherry. Sometimes a drink is a great solace. The snow lingered on into February, lying under the hedges and along the sides of the lanes. "Waitin' for more to come," Mr. Willett told me with morose satisfaction. "I fair hates to see it layin' this time of year. Still plenty of weeks to get another lot." "Cheer up," I said. "There's some snowdrops in bud at the end of the garden, and some lovely yellow aconites showing. And the children brought catkins for the nature table, a bit stubby yet, but cheering all the same." "Well, you always was one for looking on the bright side," said Mr. Willett. "Heard any more about this here school closing? Someone told me Mrs. Allen's leaving. That'd suit you a treat, that school of hers. Should think about it if I was you." As I had done exactly that for a considerable time with no firm result, I found Mr. Willett's remarks a little trying. "No, I haven't heard any more," I said, "and I don't think I should get that job even if I wanted it." "Well, there's plenty in the village thinks you would when this place shuts up." "What do you mean when? When this place shuts up? We don't know that it will," I broke in crossly. "No need to fly off the handle," said Mr. Willett. "I'm only saying what's going the rounds in Fairacre. But if you ask me, it's time the village had a say in this business. It's fair upsetting for us all, and we don't want to see you go. You knows that." I began to feel ashamed of my rudeness and apologized. "Oh, don't let that worry you," replied Mr. Willett. "It's a troubling time, especially for you, and at a funny age." On this unsatisfactory note, he left me. The vicar appeared at playtime, and I took him across the playground, dodging boisterous children in full flight, to have a cup of coffee while Hilary coped with playground duty. The gastric influenza, which had prostrated him at the time of Mrs. Coggs' court appearance, had left him looking remarkably pale and shaky, and he seemed glad to put his molting leopard-skin gloves on the table and sip hot coffee. Tibby, unused to mid-morning visitors, graciously climbed onto his lap and purred a welcome. "You really have the gift of making a proper home," smiled Mr. Partridge, "and of course a cat is absolutely essential to that. I hope you'll be here for many, many years." That rather depends on the county, I told him. If only we knew. It's about that I've come, said the vicar. My heart sank. Had he, as chairman of the managers, heard at last? I've no further news from the office, he said, and my heart started beating again. But there are so many rumors and conjectures going round the village that I've had a word with the other managers, and we feel we should call a public meeting to air our views. An excellent idea. I'm glad you agree. I feel we should put aside everything before that fellow Rochester— Salisbury, I broke in. Rochester was in Jane Eyre. Of course, Salisbury then, so that the authority has some idea of the strong reaction to this proposal of closing the school. You'll be there, naturally. When? Well, now you're asking. It will need to be in the village hall, and what with the Cubs and Brownies and square dancing and Women's Institute and the muscular dystrophy jumble sale and 3 wedding receptions, it's quite a problem to find a date. However, something will turn up, and meanwhile we must put up posters, and perhaps the children could write a note to take home? Willingly, but we shall have to know the date. The vicar picked up his gloves, deposited Tibby tenderly on another chair, from which the animal got down immediately with umbrage and made for the door. So you will. What a wonderful grasp of affairs you have, Miss Reed. I wish I were as practical. I think I'd better spend the rest of the morning working out a few dates with the managers, and then I'll call again with the result. He plowed his way to the gate through the screaming mob and smiled kindly upon one bullet-headed urchin who butted him heavily in the stomach as he fled from a pursuing playmate. A thoroughly good man, I told Tibby as I collected the coffee cups. Amy called a few evenings later with an invitation to drinks at her house in Bent. And stay on to eat with us, said Amy. The rest of them should have gone by 8, and we'll have a nice little cold collation ready and a good natter. Well, suppose they don't go, I queried. I've been to lots of these do's, particularly before Sunday lunch, where the joint is getting more and more charred as the visitors all wait for other people to make a move, not realizing that the luckier ones are staying on. That's why it will be cold, said Amy. Please allow me to run my own parties as I wish. Sometimes you are a trifle bossy. Well, I said, flabbergasted, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. You're the bossy one, as well you know. Amy laughed. I didn't come here to have a vulgar brawl, darling, but I should love a cigarette if you have such a thing in this non-smoking paradise. Of course, I said, reminded of my duties as a hostess. They're donkey's years old, but as I only buy them when I go abroad and get them duty-free, as you know, still they should be a good vintage by now. Amy puffed elegantly and seemed quite content. Are you trying for Mrs. Allen's job when she goes? Not again, I thought despairingly. No, I don't think I am. I've been turning it over, and I really feel I can't be bothered until I know more definitely about the plans for this school. I believe Lucy Colgate is trying for it, said Amy, naming a contemporary of ours at college whom I always detested. She's welcome, I said shortly. She'll be at the party, incidentally, said Amy, tapping ash from her cigarette with a rose-tipped finger. Well, it's your party, as you've already pointed out. I can be as civil as the next, I hope. I can't think why you dislike her. I don't actively dislike her. I just find her affected and a liar to boot. She's very well connected. Her uncle's the bishop of somewhere. So what? It doesn't alter Lucy Colgate for me. However, I promise to behave beautifully when we meet. She would have loved this place, you know. She always hoped you would apply for another job so that she could come here. I began to feel decidedly more cheerful. Well, she won't have the opportunity now, will she? If Fairacre stays, then I do. If it closes, no headmistress will be necessary, not even horrible Lucy Colgate. Amy began to laugh, and I followed suit. Tell me the latest about Vanessa, I said, changing the subject. How's that baby? My dear, she's having another. She can't be. She's only just had this one. It can happen, said Amy. It's not due for another 7 months. She told me on the phone last night. I must say that in my young days, one waited until one was quite 5 months gone, as the vulgar expression is, before admitting coyly to one's hopes. But there, I gather from a doctor friend that you have to book your nursing home bed quite 12 months in advance, so I suppose there's no encouragement to being over-modest about the proceedings. I'd better look out my knitting patterns for baby clothes again, I said. I suppose she wouldn't like a tea cozy this time? I'm halfway through one. Try her, advised Amy, looking at the clock. I suppose there's no chance of a cup of coffee? I do apologize, I said, making for the kitchen. I seem to have forgotten my manners. You must take a lesson from dear Lucy, said Amy wickedly, following me. Her manners are quite perfect, and what's more, she makes delicious coffee. Well, so do I told her, putting on the kettle, when I think of it. A few days later, the vicar appeared, waving a slip of paper in triumph. At last, my dear Miss Reed, we have a fixed date, though at what cost of time and telephone calls I shudder to think. Here we are. It is for March the 1st, a Friday. That seems to be the only free day for most of the managers. Henry Maughan has a lecture on seabirds to give in Caxley, but Mrs. Maughan says she's heard it a dozen times and there will be no need for her to attend. I remembered how competently she looked after her dithering husband on these occasions, and asked if he would be able to manage without her support. Oh, yes, indeed. George Annett is going, and he says he will see that Henry has his papers in order and his spectacles and so on. As George Annett can be just as scatterbrained as Henry Maughan under pressure, I felt that it would be a case of the blind leading the blind, but forbore to comment. We'll copy this out today, I assured the vicar, securing the slip of paper under the massive brass inkstand which has adorned the head teacher's desk here since the time of Queen Victoria. Splendid, splendid, said Mr. Partridge, making for the door. It will be a good thing to see how the wind blows in the village. Nothing but good could come of airing our feelings, I feel sure. Help me with the blackboard, Ernest, I said as the door closed behind the vicar. We'll start straight away on these notices. Good, said Ernest with approval. Save us doing them horrible fractions. They'll come later, I told him. But maybe we can skip over the fractions before next time.